Okay, I'd like to talk now about some of the work that we've done in the research aspect of our work. There were a number of vocabularies gathered in Kenai in the 19th century, actually more than you find for a lot of American Indian languages. There were a number of these are collected in Schiefner, 1874, which was published in St. Petersburg, and by oversight I forgot to put that in the bibliography in the book that you have. I can write the footnote up for you. You'll never find it though. It's I think it's in Peabody Museum in Harvard. You never find the thing, but I have a Xerox of it. It's written in German and published in Russia. But that collected a number of the early vocabularies that were gathered in Kenai, including the Rezanoff vocabulary of over 1,000 words, which was gathered in 1805. And then this whole thing by Schiefner was translated in English by Teenart sometime in the 1870s or so, and that manuscript is at Yale, which is English and English and French translations of the German manuscript. And then there was a very interesting vocabulary by Stafiev and Petrov gathered here in Kenai in 1885. That's the same Ivan Petrov that Morgan Sherwood was talking about this morning. And this is a pretty interesting vocabulary, rather extensive. There must be over 1,000 items in that, too. And then the only thing ever printed in the language in this century was the Osgood, the vocabulary in the back of the Osgood's ethnography of the Tenaina. Now, all of these vocabularies were not written accurately. None of them were written accurately, but we can reconstruct those and we can learn to read those back. And we do a re-elicitation of those. I go over those part of the time in my work with Fedosia and Bertha and Peter. I've been reading back those words, and we come up with a lot of archaic vocabulary that way. Not finished with this by a long shot, but we come up with quite a bit from using those old vocabularies, and they do help fill in the linguistic picture. So that was one project that we've been working on. I've done a lot of, actually spent most of my time on grammatical studies of the language, and first thing I did was work on the sound system and the phonetics of the language in connection with developing an alphabet for the language, a practical alphabet for teaching, for use in teaching the language, and was doing that in the fall of last year, a year ago. And with Dr. Mike Krause and myself, we came up with the final versions of the alphabet last fall in November or so, a year ago. Then I've done studies of aspects of the grammar of Tenaina, a few of which I've written up, but not much that I've written up. Most of it's in my notes. I have a slip file dictionary on little 4x6 slips of paper. And they call that a stem list, and I make a collection of all of the parts of the words in the language. And whenever I hear a word that I haven't heard before, not just a word, but a portion of a word that I haven't heard before, I make an entry for it, and I put a lot of time into that. And it's just in pencil on these little slips, and then in my notes, I've got a lot of information on the grammar and how words are put together and how sentences are put together, and done a lot of study on the verb in the language and the variations that the language undergoes, the variations that a single word undergo. Want to talk about this now, just briefly. The reason Athabascan is so complicated is because of the verb. And the verb has a stem in it, like a sort of a kernel meaning, and then it has all these prefix positions which go to the left of it or before the stem. And there are 13 positions in front of a stem, which makes it probably the most complicated single word complex of any language in the world. And a word like a verb, which we're going to demonstrate now, can be conjugated. It seems almost endlessly, but it's not. It's not endless. But there's hundreds of forms that some verbs can be put into. Any common ordinary verb can take about 60 forms, and these are single word variations within a single word. So most any old verb can have 60 forms, and then some of them this can go into the hundreds. I haven't really calculated it. I know, over 200 forms you could do for some verbs. It's incredible. And the thing is, it's all entirely regular. It's all very regular, very patterned. It's just that the irregularities are so elaborate and so complicated to state. It just strikes you as a very ingenious, very, very graphic language, the way they put things together. Let me show you some things. Maybe Fedossi, here's a microphone here, and I'm going to go to the blackboard and I'm going to write down some words that Fedossi says. Before we go into this, I skipped the dialect territories, and in fact I just have to turn the blackboard around again. I'm really happy about that question, so somebody else asked me some questions in a few minutes, see what else I forgot. Part of my research has been on a dialect survey of Tenaina, and I've worked with speakers from all the Tenaina villages, the Denaina villages. At this point, that's over 30 people that I've worked with, and I've pinned down what seem to be 3 dialect areas within the language. There's a dialect boundary that goes through Tyonek and formerly Point Possession. There used to be a village in Point Possession, I understand. And then in the Upper Inlet area, I call that the Upper Inlet dialect. And then that's the major dialect difference within Denaina is from Tyonek and in the Upper Inlet area. And then there's a minor dialect boundary between Kenai and Seldovia on the one hand, and then the inland Denainas from Iliamna and Dalton and Lime Village. So this dialect boundary between Tyonek and for the Upper Inlet area is of more major consequence, and makes that a little harder to understand. These 2 dialects here, what I call the Outer Inlet dialect, which I grouped Kuskotan too formally within this Outer Inlet dialect, Kuskotan, Seldovia, and Kenai as an Outer Inlet dialect. Those 3 villages, Kuskotan, Seldovia, and Kenai as an Outer Inlet dialect, and then Iliamna area, Pedro Bay mainly, and Dalton and Lime Village as an inland dialect. And those 2 dialects are fairly close, but still defined by certain features. So those are the three dialects within the language. I want to talk a little more about that in a few minutes, about some of the implications of the dialect work for studying about Tenaina history. I don't have a great deal to say about it, but I'll make a few comments about it. Okay, back to where we were. I'd like to take a verb, and I should mention that, like I've mentioned how elaborate the verb is and how many forms you can have for a word. And Fedossi is absolutely the very best person I've ever worked with in this kind of material in a language. She's got remarkable analytical skills. She's so patient, most patient person I've ever met, and is just very careful in pointing out my mistakes and correcting me, and keeping very, just to the most minute detail, following through extremely strong analytical powers it takes, and she is so quick at it. She's as talented as anybody I've ever seen. And I've heard other people make that comment too. Dr. Krause mentioned that when he met Fidacia last year, and he's worked with many speakers of Alaska Native languages, and he made the same comment. So, let's take a verb to cut, like, like if we were going to say we're cutting fish, or like you use if you're cleaning fish, you know that one, Fidas? Yeah. Okay, say that for them. Just the last word, astus. Move a little closer in front of you toward the. Yeah. Just say astus. Astus. Now that's a present tense of a verb, which means I'm cutting it. And we write it like this. Astus. Now, let's do the Ladu form. Okay, do you hear the difference? Say the two for them for us. And then the first one again. Astus. And then Ladu form. Lastut. Okay, this is a pastime form. I asked her to put the word yesterday in front of it to make it the past time, like I was cutting it yesterday. So this part of the word us here means some notion of cutting, and then the us is the I form, and also contains within it the notion of this present action and ongoing action of cutting. So I'm cutting it. And then I said, do the adu form, which is the yesterday, the past time form, and she puts this ra in front of it, which marks a past time. And then toots, instead of toots, she says toots, and that's a sign of the meaning part of the stem part of the word changing its time, in this characteristic change in the word. So it changes in two places, out here to the left in the prefixes, and then in the stem. This is the stem, and these are some of these 13 prefix positions that go on out here. Okay, you haven't seen anything yet. Okay, Nishkonda. Okay. I'm just saying a key word for her. This is how we often work. I'll say a key word and she changes it. We're very efficient this way. She just rattles these off. And we're going very slowly at this time. We can streak through these. This is a dictionary entry. This is a more elaborate dictionary entry than I usually do, but this is an example of a dictionary entry for a verb. Okay, this is a future form where the T and the GH marks a future meaning I will, and then the S again marks I am doing this. And then, I just made a mistake. This word ends in an S. So this part of the word us here is like it was over here in the present form of the word, but the prefixes are changed again. There are three prefixes represented in this word. There's the S here for I, and then the ra and the t, which sort of combine to make the future. Then there's another way you can cut. I customarily cut like a nuitel kushko form for us. Okay, that's a different one now. That's a customary form, like I cut, and that would appear in sentences like every summer I cut fish, astis, or you could say shanta shoka astis. I cut fish every summer. That's different than that I'm cutting it now, or that I did cut it, or that I will cut it. And this again is a single word change. This looks like this one, astus, except that the stem now has changed with this I in it, and that has to do with a customary action. And then there's one more, let me cut it. Let me cut it. Yeah. And this is a special form, special construction, like I'm going to cut it, or let me do it, lastusne. And again, now we get a different prefix complex. It looks something like this prefix complex in the past time, but it's really a little different than that too. And then there's a suffix on the end, ni, which is characteristic of this tense in the verb. Now these are all positive forms. I'm going to cut it. I neglected to mention, just for sake of clarity, that there's 5 other ways to do each one of these. There are 6 persons that appear in a verb, 6 actors, 6 possible subjects of a verb. Let's take astus vras and go through the ninku, yinku, nanaku, chaniku, and yinaku forms.
Astus.
And then ninku.
Nanku. Antus.
Yinan.
Yinanku yatus.
Yatus. Nanaku.
Nanaku. Chatus.
Chatus. Chaniku.
Chaniku. Chatus.
Chatus. And yinaku.
Yinaku chatus.
Chatus. Okay. I won't write all those for sake of space, but each one of these could be done in 6 different ways, changed by the prefixes. The actors, that's I'm cutting, you're cutting, we're cutting, he's cutting it, we're cutting it, you guys, you plural are cutting it, and those guys are cutting it. Those are all separate single word variations. Now, on top of this, we have the negatives. They have separate single word negatives. Okay, I'm not cutting it. Okay, that's the negative of this. There we get, and this is sometimes said with a Z or a Y, here's zistuz or yistuz. Here, the ending has changed from S to Z, and the prefix complex changes. Okay, I didn't cut it. Astis. Here we get tuts becomes tis, and then the us kind of looks like the us in the present time again. That means I didn't cut it in the past. I'm not going to cut it. Beautiful example of the increasing complexity of the language. The stem changes for the future, negative, us to us, and then there's a negative marker, an us put out here, and then still the future marker here, so that means I won't cut it. And then the negative of the customary translation, like I never cut it. Like I never cut fish. Shanta, ushta. Yes, tees. And there again, the stem changes. The tees becomes tees, and then the prefix complex changes for a negative structure again. And then one more form that would be different would be don't cut it. Usiku. This is a negative imperative. Don't do it. Usiku. Don't cut it. Usiku. Now, that's just if... Okay, now all of these on the bottom, just like all these at the top, could be done 6 different forms. So that's 60 forms. And that's a verb for cutting fish. Now, if I were to be cutting wood, what happens if I'm cutting wood for us? Chika. Okay, or shiku chika destus. Okay, now if I happen, this astus was only if I'm cutting fish. If I'm cutting wood, you put a D out here. So if I'm cutting wood, all of this is multiplied over again with a D in it. For example, let me cut some wood is drastusni. So there's a D. Instead of drastusni, it becomes drastusni. Or if I'm not cutting wood right now. Odikti Kushta
Kustak Ustastus.
Uzdastuz. So Yastuz is now Uzdastuz for I'm not cutting wood. Well, like I said, Fedossia is best person I've ever seen. It's just concentrating and sorting these out and being patient, and what she's contributed to the understanding of the grammar of her language is really, I think is really beautiful and of extreme importance for our study of Athabascan linguistics. And this also shows you why the Eskimos never learn Athabascan, and why nobody else does either. That was beautiful. Are there particular questions right now? Yes? Yeah. Well, that restut is a perfect tense. It's a completed action. I cut it. I cut it. You know. Also, I should mention, you really haven't seen. You've only seen a portion of the complexity. There are three separate types of past tense. The left form, like the restuts, in the center, middle, and the top, is one of the three past tense. No, there's four. I forgot one. There's four types of ways of making past tense in the verbs. It's an unbelievable memory load to study if you were just to study this. I've worked with some of the Navajo teaching programs in the Southwest, and the progress people make in studying Navajo is abysmal, you know, and people are really motivated. It's a strong language, and a lot of people are interested. Of course, we don't have the best in the way of pedagogical materials, but the memory load that this represents is staggering. I also think that this is a factor in why the language is declining in number of speakers in a sense, because what you find is you can't be a bad speaker of Athabascan. If you are, your weaknesses as a speaker become so evident that you're discouraged in going on in it, and that's what you find in these communities where there is a mixture of, you know, the older generation speaks, and then maybe the middle-aged generation understands, and the younger generation, you know, doesn't know too much of the language. It sort of works that you're kind of discouraged in a way to improve, because it's so hard to handle it all, to remember it all. And it does accelerate language loss. And that's not true in Eskimo communities where there's such a thing as bad Eskimo being spoken, you know. Athabascan, when it's spoken, is the pure stuff, and you either learn it or you don't learn it. And you learn it when you're a kid. Some of this work is I'm pulling together in some publications and things, studies of this, but most of it that won't be printed or even typed up for a long time, and I'm still continuing the work. Now, going back on the dialect survey work, there are, like I said, these three regions of the Tenaina language, and I'm continually adding information to this all the time. I've added some since I wrote up the paper for your book here, and but there's one typo in that paper. I don't have it right here with me. Maybe I should point it out. In case some of you are interested in looking more at the particulars of dialect classification for this language, on page 36 of your book, see the next to the last paragraph, the last sentence in the next last paragraph says the Upper Inlet dialect contains a detailed discussion of the classification of Tenaina dialects. I don't know if anybody wondered about that sentence. But that should say that carry to appear A contains a detailed discussion of the classification of Kenai dialects. And I'm referring you to the bibliography. And what I'm saying is that in this paper, in the bibliography, under my name, to appear A is a thing I wrote, a preliminary classification of Kenai dialects, which will be, I think will probably be printed in the Anthropological Papers of the University of Alaska. And then I talk about dialect classification for this in more detail, and I list some of the particular things that you look at in dialect classification. I can't really go into too much detail right now, but what you find is shadings of differences throughout Cook Inlet. Speaking like this, Kashnash, Kashnash. In Dalton, if you say that, it's like this. And I write this with an X. It's Kashnach, Kashnach. This is Kashnash. It ends in this SH sound in the Kenai area, but in Dalton it's Kashnach. And in Upper Inlet area, the SH becomes more of an S, and it's kind of like this, Kasnas, Kasnas. So here you have the same word pronounced in three different ways throughout the Kenai area. Kashnach, Kashnash, Kasnas. And so in the classification of dialects, we try and track down any number, like a couple of dozen properties like that of the language. What I find there's some things of historical interest in this. I think the Upper Inlet Kenai dialect, from the Eklutna and Susitna in particular, is very strongly influenced by the Atna language, and many of the things which mark the Upper Inlet dialect are Atna types of features. There are some signs of Chugach Eskimo or Suksutun influence on the Kenai Seldovia language. It's very superficial, but you find some Eskimo words used for fish, certain marine animals and things, and you find a very interesting thing, for example, in Peter and Fedosia's language. If you take a word like, how about Fedos, would you say, I'm going to put my hat on? Say that further. Well, here, say it right here.
No,
Hear the whisper in that? And that's, Eskimo has whispered sounds. They have voiceless vowels. And she said, she whispers two of the vowels in that word. And that's an Eskimo language trait, and it's most of the Tenina dialects don't do it, or they don't do it so strongly, but here in Kenai they have that whispered quality to the speech, which is very beautiful when you hear it spoken. And that's another sign of an Eskimo influence on the language. Yes? There are about 100 Russian loanwords in the language. I was going to mention that. Right, it's hard to give a talk about something like this. It has so many sides to it, so many aspects. But let me come back to that in a minute on loanwords. There is a very superficial but nevertheless interesting little signs of some Eskimo influence on the Outer Inlet Tenina dialect. I regard the inland Tenina dialect of Lime Village and Dalton as the most conservative of the language. I think most of the other changes in the language are subsequent to the things that you find in those particular dialects, and I think that is going to be of some significance historically in study of the history of the Dena'ina people. The Pedro Bay dialect in Lake Iliamna area is interesting because I basically group it with the inland Denainas of Nandalton and Lime Village, but it starts to shade a little bit like Kenai and Seldovia dialect.